Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ricardo Bosi, National Leader of Australia One, and welcome to this Green Room Extra for 13 September 2024. We've got a very special one today. We have SG on, and it'll be a straight one-on-one. He's going to give us the updates that only he can do. You're all familiar with SG, that mellifluous voice that just gives you the truth, but in a way you need to hear it. So we'll get straight into it. He's going to be covering a full range of issues today. So let's bring the man in and let's kick off. SG, good evening. How are you?
Doing well, Mr. Bosi. Thank you for having me back.
Absolutely. Well, we're at a critical point in the war for the world. We're not quite at the Schwerpunkt, which is that critical moment where the battle is either won or lost. We know we've won it, but it's certainly critical in the minds of the observers, in the minds of the people who are increasingly becoming aware that if they don't know exactly what's happening, they certainly have a sense that something is not right, that undefined, uncrystallized concern in their minds that something is off. And so let's help them make that transition from where they are to where they need to be. So now there's any number of issues we can discuss. World War III, nuclear war in Europe, the Ukraine, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the US border, the potential for a civil war in the US, the US election, the financial crash, are cryptos good? There's a range of issues that are of interest to just about everybody watching, but I'm going to let you set the agenda simply because you've got that perspective of the pieces as they fit together. And if we have time at the end, we might even throw in some observations for Australia to let the Australians know what is going on. So with that introduction, I'll hand over to USG and away we go.
Well, I have to admit, Lieutenant Colonel, that's an incredible introduction. I thank you for it. I'm humbled. In the broader sense of everything that you just described, right? We could have an entire hours-long podcast breaking down any of those agenda items, just by themselves. What got us there? What were the geopolitical motivations at play? How does worldwide finance, Western world governments, the former NATO, the former Commonwealth realms, the NATO countries, all of that, it ties back into each and every one of those issues. So fundamentally, let me start with this. The 50,000 foot view, if we want to call it that, is that we have managed in the last 2 years especially, but really ever since 2020, we have managed to push ahead with an agenda that is anti-globalist in the background, in the machinations, in the guts of the machine, even though we've seen the forward-facing progression and destabilization and really erosion of our Western world countries, massive amounts of exposure for organized criminality, Gotham-style mafiosos in nearly all of the NATO countries, for example, the NATO warlords being more and more drawn out and then publicly, increasingly more in recent weeks, publicly named by individuals like Mike Benz and others that have, a great deal of research and a tremendous amount of experience in how this bureaucratic monster that has enslaved a great deal of what we would call the global north has actually operated over the last half century. So fundamentally, all of those arenas that you described a moment ago are servicing a role in destabilizing and removing that power structure. Unfortunately, the public-facing component of that is likely to be last or very near last to the party because so much of that power structure is very deep, it's very dark, it's very well entrenched. It's sort of like a Liam Neeson Taken style movie ramped up a little bit, maybe throw in some Denzel Washington military thrillers, and you've got really a good basis mixed in with some Tom Clancy novellas for what's actually happening in the world now and what has happened in the world over the last 75 years. The U.S. State Department has been heavily engaged in nation building since the close of the Second World War. The United Nations has never existed to prevent war. As a matter of fact, it exists to foment conflict and help those same institutions, globalist oligarchs that we reference and that your audience is going to be very familiar with, to maintain and expand their power. And post-Trump administration, especially after the obviously fraudulent election here in the United States of America, where extraordinary continuity operations had to be implemented in order to save literally the world, we have been moving that needle forward in the arena of finance. Just recently, we saw the Rothschild Bank in Monaco shutter one of its main operatives and send them sort of packing out the door. This was a 24-year veteran of the Rothschild dynasty name. We've seen a number of different large celebrity homes, including P. Diddy's mansion, just listed for sale for a cool $61 million, I believe, dollars. And that won't be the last of those to be seen coming out of the Diddy the developments, the problems that gentleman is having. He's essentially, for the audience out there, in a real Reader's Digest way, Sean Diddy Combs was one of the Epsteins of the music and rap industry, right along Dr. Dre and a couple of others. So, what we have going on, Colonel, is a multi-angular assault happening in finance, happening in military pulpits, with more than 145 commanders now removed in the United States of America's armed forces for loss of confidence in the ability to command. That's more than a 900% increase, just by the way, over and above the prior 4 decades worth of removals for that exact reason, which tells us that there's a clearly an anti-saboteur operation going on. There's a seek out and destroy operation occurring inside those military ranks. I would venture to assume that that's likely occurring inside every major significant military player in this process. We saw a coup in China going back to 2022, where Xi and the patriotic Chinese military actually put a stop to it and utilized that to consolidate a significant amount of Chinese military intelligence back to what we would consider a humanist, patriot, for the people side, if we want to call it that. Definitely self-interested in their people, but not interested in destroying humanity for an occult agenda. And the same, I think, has been true of a lot of these different players. So fasting forward to now, that's a long basis for where we're at. What are we faced with? We're faced with essentially 7 weeks left until this election season in November here in the United States. We know a great deal of this process kicked off in a coordinated fashion with the marker of the November stolen election in 2020 that was allowed to happen as a much larger marker to essentially utilize a framework for a World War III style training operation to not only marry a lot of joint force capabilities across the spectrums throughout those worldwide military players and allies, but also to root out again and draw out this same monster. At the same time, we've been assailing the petrodollar very near constantly over the last 2.5 to 3 years. The Manchurian has done just an absolutely phenomenal job of destroying the Federal Reserve, the central banking empire in the NATO Western world, weakening it, exposing it to levels of derivatives exposure and weakness exposure with bond markets worldwide that's never been seen before, all coalescing at the same time that Russia, China, the BRICS nations in general, plus all of the major oil producing giants and all of the Middle East nations, save Israel, are also seeking to divest away from the dollar, take more control over their own resources, their own commodities that they bring to the fore. So we're expecting that, I think, in that same time period as well. We're also having to look at the backdrop of irregular military operations worldwide. We talked about Predator's Run just a moment ago, prior to going on air for the discussion, how that was essentially a training operation for the Marine Corps of the United States to practice rapid force deployment in an emergency situation to the Australian area of operations. They did that with a number of thousands of troops. We have the Marine Corps conducting operations right now in Indonesia. We have the U.S. Marine Corps in the Philippines as well. At the same time, and it's worth noting that just today, the Australian ambassador for the Philippines put out an ex-post discussing this. It's the same time that the Australian civilian, let me make sure that I've got the actual name right for you, Colonel. The Australian Civil Military Center and the Office of Civil Defense for the Philippines are working on joint humanitarian assistance and disaster relief tabletop exercises, which means they're planning to respond to a crisis in a joint force fashion very soon. So that's a huge setup for our call today. All of it is intermingled. All of it is interconnected. We're still looking for a couple of different things on the game board. The explosivity in the Pacific is not out to where we would expect to have been by now. Personally, I was surprised that we got beyond the conclusion of August with no movement there. It tells me the Chinese are really playing a long game. We're expecting something out of Korea. The alignment between Pyongyang and Moscow, in particular, with their usage of military technologies across the spectrum, and Pyongyang transferring significant military communications away from Chinese satellites, rehosting those communications on Russian satellites outside of NATO intelligence services and security services, purview. I think that we're really expecting a whole lot here in the coming weeks. And they're up against the shot clock, Lieutenant Colonel. We're at a period of time now where they're going to have to put that ball in the air, or someone's going to call the foul anyway. I'm sorry, sir. I cannot hear you.
Right?
Maybe muted.
I thought you dropped out. No, I thought you dropped out. No, that's the extraordinary wrap up of all the large tectonic shifts around the globe. And if the viewers at home are having difficulty keeping up with it, don't be embarrassed, because all of us are aware that these big shifts are interconnected, as SG said, and it's difficult to know what you're looking at sometimes. And you've heard that expression. What am I looking at here? Because we need that explanation. So with that, SG, just keep on plowing ahead. I think we're doing a good job here.
Well, I guess as we look at the landscape out before us, the biggest question that a lot of people out there have, and especially that are going to be coming from the Australian electorate base and the North American electorate base, to include Canada and the United States, is how far are they really willing to allow some of this to go? How far before enough is enough, so to speak? And that's the magical question that I think is on everybody's lips, and it doesn't fall on deaf ears here. I completely understand where the question comes from. I understand the spirit that it's offered, but fundamentally, it was asked of me just a couple of days ago. Actually, I think it was on a broadcast, if I'm not mistaken. What are we looking at with respect to, the invasion that has happened in the United States of America, for example? How dangerous are we going to allow this to get before we have to intervene and move on something? And the answer that I gave was one that I haven't necessarily phrased in that framework before. It sort of came to me, and I'm really going to try and double down on it here a little bit. When we are wanting to drain the swamp, when the goal is to drain the swamp worldwide, right? Not just DC, but every corruption pulpit in all of the Western world nations, Australia, New Zealand, certainly included in that, all of the Five Eyes community included in that, and all of the global North and sub-global North protectorate nations, even though they don't class themselves as that. Fundamentally, that's how they've operated for a long time. If we're going to remove the swamp from that, we have to make the swamp in all of those arenas legitimate military targets of a lawful militarized preservation operation. And that's exactly what we're doing. And that's exactly how we're building this and have been building this really since the days of President Trump. It's one of the reasons Trump left Executive Order 13224 in place. That was an order signed by the 43rd President of the United States on the 23rd of September 2001, which effectively neutered about half of the Bill of Rights of the Constitution, suspended habeas corpus, and placed the United States into a silent, emergency actioned military police state. So to resolve that and to bring that to fruition, those emergencies have to close, and they have to come to a lawful close and a final close in order for any president or commander-in-chief operating the administrative arm of the president to be able to bring those emergencies publicly to a fruition, to a point of cessation and completion. So Executive Order 13224 is one example in this, but I'm going to drill down on this because it paints the picture really, really well. When we talk about the utilization of military force to drain the swamp, there is a tremendous process that has to be gone through to allow for this, because fundamentally all of the Western world nations sort of have this ethos, and in many cases have codified laws that prevent the use of the military as a posse comitatus, as an extension of a mercenary force, as a bludgeoning arm of a political party that would just essentially put into place a period of endless juntas. Sorry about that. Endless juntas here in the Western world. The United States is certainly no stranger to that. Australia, I'm sure, has similar restrictions on how the military can be utilized, except in cases of extraordinary preservation and emergency. So we have to create, or rather allow, a militarized threat that exceeds the capability of civilian authorities and law enforcement authorities to respond. The language is very similar, actually, to the Insurrection Act of 1807, which states that civilian authorities can no longer respond, or no longer capable of responding to the growing unrest within the territories. So when we look at the posse comitatus and what it restricts the military in any form of law enforcement whatsoever. In other words, if a civilian agency or institution is capable of quelling whatever unrest is going on, the military is actually prevented from operating in the United States. It's not just a good idea for them to stay on the sidelines. They cannot step in. until a point where we see such an emergent condition that civilian authorities are either paralyzed and incapable of responding, or they're completely decapitated and incapable of responding. I think what we have growing right now in the United States and in a number of these Western world nations is exactly that condition: a coordinated foreign-inspired attack aimed at a number of different levels of interference. But one of those levels of interference here in the U.S. is going to be with respect to the election cycle and the election process. And we just saw 3 days ago, on I believe it was Monday of this week, the 9th of September, so 9/9, we just saw the Manchurian administration extend Executive Order 13848 for yet another 12 months. This establishes a national emergency with respect to foreign interference in the United States election process. So foreign-inspired paramilitaries and gangs, organized crime, assisted by domestic actors, and then foreign agencies, institutions, NGOs, we'll just call them the tentacle runoff from the UN globalist pulpit of power. All of these organizations, entities, individuals, and institutions in this process of militarized contest against the United States of America, beginning with a terrorist attack that's been facilitated by all of the institutions I just referenced, they make themselves, in so doing this, a lawful military combatant on the battlefield of war. So we change the jurisdiction here from a political resolution and a law enforcement resolution to the crisis or to the emergency, and we bring in the need and, in fact, the requirement that a militarized force adjudicate a militarized threat. Well, what's really happening, if I can be so blunt, is that we're allowing the political civilian pulpits of the UN and all of the infiltrative arms that pulpit or those pulpits have managed to encroach upon in the Western world, including academia, finance, healthcare, big business, transnational corporations, chemical companies, nonprofits, 501s, 502s, 504s, all of these different bureaucratic corporate extensions that we're all familiar with. We are allowing them to turn themselves from civilian combatants to militarized opponents. In that sense, we are going to be able to not only put a stop to a tremendous amount of worldwide organized crime, because of course all of them are here in the United States right now, but we will also be able to trace back the organizers, the funders, the facilitators, and the planners of said organized crime to those same globalist pulpits that launched COVID-19.
That's extraordinarily interesting because going back to your comment about the resistance of Western governments to allow their militaries to operate except in extreme circumstances is common in Australia. The military has no power to operate without a directive from our Governor General, and it requires a formal request for Defence Force aid to the civil power. Now, what's interesting is in terms of that, and at the time, well, in retrospect, it's been the white hats using the black hats strategy against themselves. Some years back, the government passed a bill here in Australia, what was called the Defence Bill Enhancement. That's the short term. But what it allowed the government to do is to bring in foreign police and foreign militaries and to allow them to act with impunity within the Australian borders, which is anathema to the Australian people. We don't like having the military on our streets. It just doesn't work with our culture. And yet here was the government allowing that law in. And there were a lot of liars revealed themselves by saying there was nothing to worry about, but there's plenty to worry about, because that was the law that they used to bring in foreign police dressed in black riot gear to beat and injure and spray and hurt the protesters. So it wasn't just the Australian police that were doing it, they were bringing in outsiders as well. But what that cleverly appears to do is it circumvents now. The white hats can use that same law. Not that there is any law in this country. We understand that there is no law. But for the sake of appearances, it allows the white hats to use that same law against the black hats. So it's an interesting little development. The Australian people don't accept military in the same spirit as, say, the US. You have a strong veterans community. Ours has been intentionally decimated by the neglect of our veterans, for example. through the lack of provision for assistance, compensation, any consideration at all. To put it bluntly, the politicians want the veterans to go away and die. They want their parents completely destroyed emotionally and psychologically. They cannot afford to have a large, energized veteran community that holds the government to account. The government does not want the numbers of the dead and injured, not just through war, but through the use of them through the injections, which they've been doing for years now. They'll inject troops deploying overseas. Big Pharma has a free hand with them. And so we don't have that same powerful veterans community. And so the resistance to the military is a tough one to fight. But believe it or not, the statement military is the only way is now gaining currency in this country, because they realize that we have been invaded, that war has transitioned from a purely military activity through to economic war, political war, cultural war, financial war. It's all part of the same boat. It was an attempt by the globalists to transition away from a sovereign state to a corporate state. And way back when, even Bill Clinton was saying things like, oh, well, smart people are saying that the days of the sovereign state are over, and we need an international view of the planet, which is true, but predicated on national sovereign states. And the push we are now moving towards, as you can see it across the planet, is strong sovereign states protecting their own. So that's an interesting one. Thank you. Would you like to go on to something else, or can I give you a lead in that for a comment or two, please?
No, please. Let's do a lean in. I imagine we'll end up in those other arenas anyway.
Sure. Okay. The one that we know is going to have the biggest immediate impact is the US election. And about a year ago, I said there wasn't going to be one. 6 months later, I said I think there might be one, because the end state required by the White Hats is unequivocal support for DJT. That must be seen nationally, and it must be seen internationally to allow him to do what must be done to lead this war for the world. Now, I'm not asking for your prognostications of whether it's going to occur or not, but what are the issues that the people should be considering in watching this period between now and November 6th?
Well, with respect to going all of the way to the election or not, I would say that that's probably still out there on the table. But we did get a tremendous clue from the commander-in-chief on the 9th of June, incidentally, the same day that his buddy Crown Prince bin Salman in Riyadh terminated the petrodollar agreement forever and killed that vampire, that he hoped the military revolts at the voting booth, referencing November the 5th. This is a man who is aware that every single syllable that flies from his lips has really scrutinized, played backwards, forwards, and sideways by every information outlet in the world for more than 8 years, really, at this point. The choice of words there was not by accident, and it was not a careless, off-of-the-cuff statement. And yet President Trump's personality would lend the onlooker that's sort of no more the wiser towards that same type of a conclusion. It was a masterful stroke in irregular warfare and consciousness communication. What President Trump, I think, is telling us, though, in that sense, is that as we go through this period of time from August, September towards that November season, as we start to experience the pressure inside the pressure cooker, right? We've built a canner now that the valve has popped up worldwide, especially here in the United States. We're just building redundant pressure to destroy the system, to bring it to the point of absolute failure so it can no longer be used again. As we look at that progress and that process, by the time we arrive at the election time frame, or whenever that election time frame might be referenced in the scope of militarized events, you could be looking at, say, 96 hours on either side of that, for example, that we're going to see tremendous events which may begin drawing public sentiment for exactly that. This is just a hypothetical, but let me walk your audience through a very plausible situation here. We're now at the 12th of September. We have about 7 weeks left, I think, at this point, right at 7 weeks, maybe a couple of extra days. When we look at business days, we're under 70 days, if I'm not mistaken, to actually arriving at the date of the election. Trump has told us that a 1929 style event is likely to come if Kamala ends up installed as president. On the 17th of August, 8 plus 17 is 25, The Hill ran an article titled "Democrats Might Still Invoke the 25th Amendment to Make Kamala President." So if we see Biden sidestepped and removed, circumvented in what is an active, ongoing coup of the presidency of the United States, which President Trump has already seeded the narrative with over the last 4 to 6 weeks or so, with respect to Biden quitting the race through a very suspect online post, didn't even have the right letterhead, for example. The vice president doesn't give any commentary on this for more than 20 days. All of this sort of is setting up this very believable component where we could see the 25th Amendment invoked as recently as, or as soon, maybe is a better way to say it, is in the next, say, 5 to 15 days, just as a hypothetical here for our discussion. Moving forward from that, we would see immediate downturns in the markets, which would lead us into October and a potential market event. We know that the Eurozone has to come down, as well as the North American financial markets. And when those events begin to happen, it's very likely that will be the jump all over it opportunity that Beijing, Pyongyang, and Tehran will realize is their golden moment. So it's very likely that all three of those actors rapidly and heavily expand whatever goals that they have within their respective areas of operation. And what that has the net effect of doing is, at the same time the financial event is already beginning because of the destabilization in worldwide sentiment with respect to an ongoing political coup in the United States of America, we would see essentially mortal blows dealt against the North American tech sector, the North American industrial sector, and all of the Western world financial system, especially as it pertains to any underpinning that's left over from the sale or sales of oil, natural gas, and crude derivatives out of the Middle East in U.S. dollars. So that then takes us very rapidly through a financial crisis that could begin to spawn off as a result of those expanded militarized campaigns. And inside of 5 to 7 days from that, you could be seeing significant market downturn, 1929 style, like President Trump has referenced a couple of different times, which would drive remarkable public sentiment. Now, in response to that, it's my full expectation that deep state remnant opponent in the political class, the headless idiots that don't really understand what they're doing, will just attempt to burn the house down at that point, because who cares anyway? So it's very likely that we see some amount of emergency power enactment utilized here in the United States. We could even see a NATO false flag with respect to Zaporizhzhia, or an attack on one of the Baltic states caused by a NATO country, then falsely blamed on Russia. An expansion of that conflict in Europe is coming. We know that the Baltic states have to be militarily intersected throughout this process because they are ancestrally Russian. That piecemealing did not occur until after the Second World War. And it's worth noting that those respective cultural groups inside those countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, more than 6 out of every 10 of those individuals identify themselves, and have always identified themselves, as Russians first, and then subsegments second. It's sort of like I'm an Arizonan first, or excuse me, I'm an American first and an Arizonan second, or an American first and a Texan second. It's the same exact sort of thing. So that particular conflict has to happen, and that would provide, I think, the basis for that in this period of time. Now, remember, we're only 10 days into, or about 15 days into, a post-coup environment in this hypothetical. So this is how rapidly these events can kick off and really begin significant movement. Just a couple of weeks ago, Dmitry Medvedev, parliamentarian president for Russia's Duma, and former president of the Russian Federation, and a strong, staunch Putin ally, shared an image graphic on his English language X account, formerly Twitter, that stated, "Odessa, we are coming." So if we look at that, in the landscape of expanded conflict on the ground, Ukraine and the Odessa city in Ukraine, not only is it ancestrally Russian, not only is it the largest port on the Black Sea outside of Sevastopol, but it's also home and host to the largest catacomb system in the entirety of the European shelf. So we've got the Russians actively stating that they're coming to this area. I think we can sort of assume that they wouldn't stop just at Odessa, that they would need to establish a secure perimeter that brings them much, much closer to the Romanian border. So you could see some amount of skirmishing happening through the Romania-Moldova area and that neck of the woods. And again, all of this happening against the backdrop of expanded conflicts simultaneously in the Middle East and in the Pacific theater. So take that just a couple of weeks beyond, or maybe just a week beyond that. We're now talking about 10, maybe 12 days without significant reliance in the financial sector in the West. We've got huge amounts of conflict breaking out in various areas of the world. I think that's the point that you're going to start seeing activation of whatever deep state terrorist cells domestically here in the Western world nations have actually set up shop. We know that we've got organized paramilitary forces here in the United States. We also know that U.S. Cyber Command and U.S. National Security Command, National Security Agency, all these sorts of types of things are tracking all of these movements. And that brings me back to the statement that I made prior to this segment of our show, talking about how you paint a political civilian adversary into a militarized opponent corner. This is how you do it. You drive them to the point of desperation where all they have left are wanton crimes of an aggressive and militarized nature against their respective population groups, against their respective borders and boundaries. And I think at that point, Colonel, you're going to see essentially military stand-ins begin popping up in the NATO Western world, essentially doing end runs, if you will, or putting a stop to the activities occurring on the ground, and then deposing or removing individuals in these respective governments that are there at present, and then outlining a pathway to return to civilian peace. And I think that's going to be cast against the backdrop of restoring financial solvency in the system and the ability to transact commerce, and also the backdrop of stopping an escalating worldwide conflict that is threatening to go nuclear at any moment. Now, again, this hypothetical is less than 21 days in length. So it's important to understand that we don't have to live through months and months of geopolitical change like we have lived to arrive at this point. When we get to the actual kinetic exchange of blows, you're talking about both sides hitting each other so hard and so fast, trying to go out on that 15th round and be the last one standing, that I think we the people are going to have our heads spinning before the day's over. You are on mute, sir.
Thanks, SG. I can see the whole scenario you've just painted being sold for the low information viewers, and that's not an insult. That's just a statement of fact. It's just hard for people to keep up. As a combination of as you say, the financial crash occurs, then you've got World War III, which is just the headline for the chaos, the military chaos you were talking about. That's the global take on it. And then nationally in your country, it's going to be the civil war that's been promoted for some time. This is what the civil war looks like. This is what World War III looks like. It's an easy sell to a low information public. So that's a most plausible set of scenarios. Most plausible. It makes every other subject seem quite prosaic from this point on. But that idea, those two ideas, the World War III globally and a civil war in the US, has that got any traction yet with the people, or is that just still a vague outline that's been put out there by any number of people?
I would say at this point, and it really has been beyond these two publicized debates that President Trump has gone on with these individuals from, the opposing side and the opposing camp, we have seen incredible congealment of consciousness and expansion of understanding happening in the last 6 to 8 weeks here in the United States. You're starting to see a great deal of the American electorate base begin to coalesce around the basic ideas: freedom of speech, freedom of due process, respect of due process, respect of the right of law, right? Understanding that there's nothing wrong with having a territorial boundary marked by a border. Just transition and traverse that border legally and you have no problems, right? You've got a lot of people that have, I think, been really, they've been holdouts more than anything else, Mr. Bosi, when we talk about the desirability of President Trump. Unfortunately, the American population, and God love us over here, we love the drama. We really enjoy the movie style thing, of getting the bad guy and people being boisterous and brazen and brash, and so we've got this balancing going on where the consciousness is trying to come around to accepting, I think, the populist candidate who is brazen and certainly bombastic and has a very heavy-hitting personality, and he's maybe not so nice sometimes when he says things, but he is interested in the country and he's the best man for the job. That's been a difficult journey, unfortunately, because we've been dealing with significant artificial divisions created in this culture, just like in all of the NATO Western world cultures over the last 40 to 50 years. And some of those divisions go back as far as the Kennedy days. It's one of the reasons I think the RFK President Trump union that occurred just a couple of weeks ago, live for the nation to see, has been such a huge atom bomb equivalent in this information and consciousness war, because now you have all of the people that were centrist Democrats, all of the people that you would consider your classical liberal thinkers who are patriots. They just don't, they're just not out in the woods shooting their gun into the tree, for example. You've got all of them, coming back and aligning behind the same mission. And that has really helped a lot of others in that camp, like Tulsi Gabbard and all of the following that she has, to come around and get behind that mission of saving things as well. So what we've got here, I think, at this point is a seriously desperate situation arising for the other side. And that leads me to the point that you were discussing a moment ago, the potential of a U.S. civil war. Dmitry Medvedev is a very salient and very forward-thinking individual coming out of Russia. He's been a savvy political figure ever since the reconstitution of Russia and the rearrangement of the government in the late 90s. And this is an individual who stated 2 years ago that he was expecting the USA to come to a civil war, or certainly a civil war temperature, a fever pitch of some kind, before this process is over. He was guesstimating it was going to be 2023. I think it's very possible that they've been pushing for that and they've not been able to get that. And I think the things that are happening now with Bobby Kennedy, the union of Tulsi Gabbard behind Trump, Elon Musk, and throwing his enormous weight in the entrepreneurial and the business sector behind President Trump just releasing a video the other day, essentially saying that a bunch of people in Hollywood actually vote for him privately because they like his policies. They're just too chicken to admit it. You've essentially got the picture being painted out here where a civil war is not going to be possible unless it is being fomented by someone, to use the Mark Twain metaphor, who is shaking our jar. And so in that process, realizing that that's happening in real time at a mass population scale, not being able to cause the population to fight one another, but certainly inflaming that population to fight you, that seems like the most poetic ending we could give these deep state morons.
Yeah, let me just dive down from the strategic to the operational tactical, and comparing Australia US. A civil war in the US must be one of the dumbest strategies the cabal could ever imagine, because I don't think. Here's my take on it. I'm not an expert on US or US people, but I've worked with a lot of your military, and I admire them. They're such admirable people. But if there was to be a civil war, it would probably last a week or two at the outside. The good guys would win, the bad guys would realize it was a really dumb strategy. I mean, it's not funny, but it is in a way, because from my perspective, it is just insane. And it speaks to the discipline and intelligence of the American conservatives to know that, yes, we can do it, but we're not going to do it. Let's exhaust every other peaceful solution first. Similarly, here in Australia, we have a smaller group of people. As I said, it's not like the US used to be in terms of people's rights. We've been demoralized over decades, disarmed, demoralized. I presume there are still people out there that would be willing to squeeze a trigger, not enough to make it effective. And as I've said, it was an option and an approach that we considered and rejected simply because it wasn't likely to win, and if it did win, it would cause a wound that would never be healed entirely, and it would give the opportunity to the black hats to do what they intended to do the whole time, to paint this picture. The reason I say all of that is this, because, as I said, a civil war in the US would be awful, but it wouldn't last 4 years like last time. It'd be over in a couple of weeks, and there'd be a lot of repairing to do. Australia, not so much. I wonder, how many Australians are ready to move, because from our perspective, we have tens of thousands of supporters who are just waiting to join up as soon as we're ready to process that number of people. But as a population, and that's always enough. You don't need everybody. You just need enough to get the job done. And we said, if we get 20% of support, we can get this done. Point number two, they've never actually seen a military execute a plan effectively. It's always been constrained by politicians who stop the war just before victory in order to sow the seeds and create the conditions for the next war. We know that. That's just common sense. But when the military finally gets an opportunity to execute a plan as it should do, from start to finish, it'll surprise the people. I suppose that was a long way of introducing this concept that I think, and I'd like your opinion, but I think the Civil War in the US would be short, sharp, and victorious, but painful and bloody, and have a long healing period. Couldn't happen in Australia because there's not enough of us quite yet awake. It wouldn't happen. We still have this very compliant, very patient population that just can withstand more and more pressure. These, we call them the yellow hats. Just leave me alone and you can do whatever you like to me. So if there was to be a civil war, and I don't think there will be, I'm not suggesting there will be, I don't think there would. But if there was to be a civil war, what would your take be on how it would be executed? And what would it look like?
You know, I would say at this point, and it would be pure speculation because there's an entity online that told us very clearly no civil war, clean and swift. But for the purpose of the hypothetical, I think that what you would be dealing with fundamentally is you would be dealing with the same thematic elements as you would have been dealing with the last time, right? States choosing to break away because I'm just not going to participate in a union functioning in this form and in this format. I've got a big economy. It would probably have to be a big economic hitter like California, Texas, potentially New York, although I don't see that happening. Florida could be a contender. South Carolina certainly would be a contender. They have a good little powerhouse economy and a huge defiant ethos down there in the Carolinian countrysides. So, you know, fundamentally, I think it would begin in that fashion, and you would immediately see some amount of U.S. Army or National Guard federalization activation because those forces have of course been federalized by the lawful president of the Constitution anyway. So in so doing, those forces would have one objective and one objective only, which would be to preserve the Union, to preserve the Republic, and defend the Constitution. Fundamentally, while their job is to also defend we the people, if some of us, for example, have to cross that beautiful rainbow bridge so that the Constitution itself can be preserved and willed on to our progeny and our posterity, I can't think of a single parent out there that would have any problem with that. And we have to think about it in terms of a very broad-reaching view on how the U.S. domestic protection forces would respond to such a huge crisis, and it would be an absolutely huge crisis. I think it is a little bit more likely that what happens in this process is we see the attempt at civil war driven not by forces within the Union in the sense that they're acting from political pulpits of power, but driven by manipulation from foreign-inspired paramilitary and organized crime gangs that are blackmailing or arm twisting those civilian pulpits. In other words, I can't, as a mayor of a large Democrat city, for example, I can't do anything about the crime because MS-13 knows where my daughter is, for example, or I can't do anything about the crime because I'm Adam Schiff in the Standard Hotel doing things that I shouldn't be doing. That are repugnant to any amount of human decency anywhere in the world. I think it's very likely that we would see, and that we're probably going to see, activation of terrorist cells that are in league and in communication and in concert with one another. That's going to appear as though there is a civil war style situation brewing, and it's likely going to appear that way very quickly in coordinated form. We know Antifa has utilized WhatsApp, for example, to coordinate tremendous amounts of on the ground same hour deployment across multiple different time zones. They're very capable of doing these types of things. And so I'm looking at it from a stance of, in so doing, to your point earlier, it's about the stupidest thing that you could contrive, because you're facing down then a domestic protection force that is at least 1 million strong, just according to executive orders. And that does not include additional activations that the acting Secretary of Defense for the Constitution, who I term the acting Minister of War, has actually chosen to bring to the force and bring about in the background. We know special operations activations have happened, and they're not even getting press releases or notoriety. We just see the literal activities showing up on social media from people sharing photographs and discussing things that are happening around the world. We know that the U.S. Marine Corps has been all over the planet and also heavily involved in training exercises, and I'm using air quotes around training there. Here domestically at home. And, this doesn't even get to the fact, Lieutenant Colonel, that we've got a tremendous amount of U.S. rail that has been moving Army equipment, armor, personnel carriers, Humvees, all manner of logistical transport vehicles across the U.S. countryside. And there's a complete information blackout from even local media outlets and local papers on any of this activity occurring. So looking at this situation, to your hypothetical, if we were to have a civil war, I would hope that patriots out there would understand that if they're going to go up against the military forces of the United States, they need to be in military organized format and militia format themselves. And that's no easy task to come about and reconcile a same force into that same orientation. I'm a little awkward with my words here, but fundamentally it's sort of like shaping the clay while you're also trying to run down the road at the same time. I think when we see this activation of these sleeper assets, that have been funneled into this country, and it's worth noting, just as a sidebar, that that's not a last 4 years issue. This is an issue with the CCP going back to 1989. It's an issue with various Colombian and South American gangs going back to H.W. Bush and the Clinton administration. They've set up entire networks here. They have infrastructure here. They have sub-economies operating in our metropolitan areas here. There's literally police stations operating on behalf of Beijing in some of our urban and metro areas, and nobody knows about it. So, this type of infiltration has been long ongoing, and bringing that activation, again, of those sleeper cells, while it may appear civil war in nature, it would be my hope and prayer for the patriot community out there to have a very steady trigger finger and wait to see what's actually happening on the ground in your community before choosing to go off half-cocked. My expectation in this entirety of this situation is that we're going to see the U.S. Army on the streets in a domestic protection fashion in at least a few localities, a significant enough number of localities in the country that we're going to bring the country to a halt, have a pause moment, have a reassess and a reevaluation moment, and likely some amount of ongoing military investigation that begins as a result of these events.
I'm grateful for that summary, because I didn't want to predicate any answer with my opinion, but the short version of all of that is it's not going to happen, because it's not going to happen. So again, a warning to the viewers out there: if you hear the threats of World War III and the threats of civil war in the US and the flow-on effects, it's a lie. A, it's dumb. B, it's not going to work. It's as simple as that. So, and the patriot community in the US is disciplined, is intelligent. They have tremendous power at their fingertips, and yet they have been most disciplined. And those few in Australia who feel the same way, same goes. They understand that's an in extremis response, and we are not there yet, even though it appears that we are, but we're not. We're a long way from that. Don't fall for the headline.
Mr. Bosi, if I could, I want to chime in and add something to that, because you just said something that I think is worth highlighting for everyone out there. We're not to that point. It's likely that we won't reach that point, but it is very likely, in my estimation, that we're going to flirt with that line. We're going to cheat death a little bit through this process, right? This is a precipice moment for humanity. This is a redefinition of what it means to interact with one another. And this is, quite frankly, a reorientation of our spiritual and moral compass that's being driven not by the militaries of the world, but by the spirit of the living God.
Absolutely correct. For those that haven't quite tweaked to the fact that this is a spiritual war with a physical component, it's time you read the tea leaves a little clearer. It is, and that's why we are as successful as we are. Without, I don't want to put too fine a point on this, but it's not about God being on our side. It's about us being on God's side, His plan, His way. It's as simple as that. And once you understand that, once you understand your role in this larger operation, whether it's called life. Things make sense. Doesn't make it any easier. It's still tough. It's kind of painful, but at least the clarity of purpose is there. The clarity of understanding is there. It's better to be informed than ignorant. Let's just put it that way. The more informed you are, the more things make sense. The more things make sense, the more you can tolerate, the more you can plan, the more you can anticipate, the more you can act with confidence. So I just wanted to kill those two ideas that I know that they're going to be selling World War III and civil wars. Not going to happen for a whole range of reasons. And once again, SG eloquently described why and how. Even in a hypothetical situation, it's not something that the Black Hats want to do, because it won't even achieve their goal of destroying the planet. Because we know that they would rather leave a smoldering rock orbiting the sun than lose. But even that's not going to occur, because we're not in that extremist situation, not even close. But as SG said, we might flirt with that just a little. Now, before you go, and there's just a couple of specific items, if you can address them, having discussed this large strategic issue, I'm curious on the latest that you've got on both Ukraine and the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Now, we have at A1, we have intentionally, we called the Ukraine out years ago. We said that Putin was doing God's work, and Ukraine needs to be brought to its knees. And then the whole country decided they wanted to support Ukraine. Our military are so brain dead that they actually believe that the leader of the Ukraine, that gay bar loitering, leather-clad dancer and comedian, is actually Winston Churchill 2.0. I mean, they seriously believe it. That's how our NPC military are, and we've sent both troops and money and vehicles over there, military equipment. The money's gone to the Democratic National, the DNC. The vehicles were vaporized within weeks of landing. But anyway, if you could just touch a little on the Ukraine and then and on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, our public position has been, we have no position, we don't care, not in our area of operations. We have 100,000 natives in Irian Jaya, which is the western half of Papua New Guinea, which is the island nation due north of our country, east of Indonesia. 100,000 being killed by Kopassus, which is the Indonesian Special Forces. So I've been trying to focus the Australians' attention on issues of interest to us and to ignore the distractions. And yes, people are dying, and Israel and Palestine, it's a real issue. I get it. I lived in the Middle East for 5 years, but it's not our issue, because there are countless conflicts around the planet, countless. And we are constantly having Israel and Palestine shoved down our throats. And I just wanted to take the position, we don't care, because they don't care about South Sudan. They don't care about the opium in Irian Jaya. They don't care about fill in the blank. And so I wanted to make that clear. But anyway, there are still people with interest, because we know that both Ukraine and the Palestinian Israeli issue are being used as stalking horses for other issues. So if you can give us a few minutes on both of those, please.
I'd be happy to. And just for the audience out there, I completely understand that as a movement there, it's not feasible, nor is it sensible to take, hugely partisan positions on issues like this, because geopolitically they're interesting, but they're not completely interconnected with what we're trying to do at a local level, I think, in any of our Western world countries. And that is sort of the indirect point of this Great Awakening. Everybody mind their own business, and we all have a great planet. So with respect to Ukraine, let's start with Ukraine first. What we have now developing out of the Ukraine is a very serious predicate for that public optic World War III style scare event beginning. President Putin gave a street interview just yesterday where he discussed this idea of the U.S. and the EU countries allowing long-range weapon systems to strike deeply inside Russian territory. And Putin correctly asserted that that has nothing to do with Ukraine. And what we're fundamentally talking about is utilizing long-range weaponry of NATO, made by NATO, of Western manufacture and out of NATO stockpiles, coordinated by NATO personnel on the ground, utilizing, NATO access codes from personnel who are either active or retired and still ancillarily involved with things, sidelined, tangentially involved, maybe is a better way to say it. Putin stated that's really a question of what we're talking about. Are we going to or is NATO prepared to be actively involved in a hot war with Russia? Because fundamentally, they understand that the Ukraine, their personnel, their service members, even if they were trained to operate some of this equipment, they would not be granted access to flight codes, to flight assignments, to guidance systems, things of this nature. People have to stop and remember that these are national security issues of the highest order. They're also patented issues, and you can actually go look up some of those patents filed under the U.S. Department of Defense, which means they are commercial in nature, which means they represent a business interest. So you have the Western military-industrial complex, the statecraft component of the military intelligence and industrial complex, all sort of tying themselves together and utilizing Ukraine essentially as this wolf in sheep's clothing, if you will, and utilizing Ukraine as the clothing of the sheep around the wolf to try and get at Russia, and Russia's not buying it. So understanding then that if that situation proceeds forward, and if we do see Western manufactured long-range weapon systems begin striking territory deeply inside Russia, I think it's extremely likely that you're going to see Russian aerial missile strikes on Western targets, specifically of a militarized format. So think missile manufacturing factories, guidance component factories, technology factories. There's a factory not very far actually from where I live. It's less than 14 city blocks from my current location as I sit here on the phone with you, that makes guidance systems for military drones. So understanding then that these would all be viable, acceptable targets in the course of a hot war, in the course of an actual military conflict, we obviously understand in our NATO Western world that if someone starts shooting missiles into our country, we're going to shoot back. This just makes, sort of common sense at the end of the day. That's why the doctrine of mutually assured deterrent and mutually assured destruction is so powerful, because nobody wants inherently to go ahead and actually pull that trigger. I think we're seeing the setup for that coming out of the Ukraine now. Now, in addition to that, and one of the things to consider with Ukraine, and we hinted at it earlier, was a false flag of some kind being caused by NATO against a NATO or a NATO interest, such as the Ukraine, and then being blamed on Russia as justification for an Article 5 invocation. And I think that's also a significant possibility when we start looking at the landscape of geopolitics and the type of 5D chess that President Putin is also playing with the NATO Western military world and the military intelligence community, who were his adversaries, by the way, for more than 30 years when he was deeply involved in the KGB and the State Security Service under the Soviet model pre-1994. So looking at this, Zaporizhzhia is a significant contender for a false flag event. The Ukrainians have been assaulting and assailing that plant for 2 years now, attempting to cause an event and blame Russia. They've not been successful in destabilizing the reactor itself, but the Russians have also not been fully successful on capturing and controlling territory to such a radius around the factory, around the power plant, that they can prevent such strikes. So it's sort of a very tenuous game where they're expending as many resources on the ground in that area as they can to prevent further assailment in a successful fashion from the Ukrainian side. And yet the Ukrainians are having to pull defenders from other areas along the front lines to meet demands like the incursion into the Kursk region of Russia that occurred with the conjunctive help of NATO personnel on the ground in both coordination and logistical procurement and deployment, but also along the front line that Russia has opened up sort of, tangential to the Kursk region in what is now modern day Kharkiv, and they're pushing that front forward and deeper into the Ukrainian countryside. So you really have a tete-a-tete going, but the Russians are doing it much more efficiently and quickly. It's also worth noting that the Russians right now are actively involved in repelling the Kursk incursion, and they're successfully destroying the Ukrainians at the rate of about 2 miles a day. So it should not be that long before we see a significant pushback and a throwback, a cracking, if you will, of the front lines of defense in Ukraine, because a significant vertebral reinforcement of that front line has been thrown into the meat grinder in Kursk, and they're not coming back to help defend and prevent things. That's one of the reasons we're seeing the rapid advance in Kharkiv that we're seeing right now. So when you marry this with the fact that Belarus not a week ago stationed more than 7,000 troops on the border, and remembering that PMC Wagner has been training and patrolling in the western Belarusian countryside for over a year and a half at this point, and they've been actively training and coordinating with in joint force training exercises the Belarusian Defense Force on the ground, I think it makes absolute sense that we're going to see a multi-directional, at least two-pronged, potentially three-pronged pincer move on Kiev at the same time that we see some sort of blitzkrieg campaign come out of both the Belarusian countryside to the north and also from the Russian front line in the south of Ukraine along the Black Sea, which is currently less than 80 miles from Odessa. So, and remember, that takes us back to Dmitri's message about Odessa. We are coming for you. That was not an unambiguous statement. So all of that sort of leads us into where we're at, presently. Now, that's a really long answer, so let's take a moment and pause for commentary if you or the audience has any with respect to that, because the Israeli and Palestine, the Middle East issue is also going to be a relatively long answer.
No, that was perfect. That was excellent. Thank you so much. And as usual, people will be listening to your words over again in the replay, because that was pregnant with so much meaning. But again, extremely prescient and extremely accurate. So we'll just leave that to go, because you heard it here first, folks. Next, let's jump to Palestine, Israel. There's so much behind this, from the Balfour Agreement to allegations of war crimes and everything in between. So I'll let you set the stage as much as you want, and then just bring us up to the present and potential future after that. Thanks, SG.
Sounds good. So when we break down the Israel-Palestinian conflict, what we're fundamentally breaking down is the first stepping stones on the broader pathway to the de-entrenchment of the Western NATO-inspired military intelligence community post World War I, but certainly well entrenched after the Second World War. They're in the countryside taking shelter underneath the guise of being the lawful Israeli government, which they are not. This is my own personal opinion. I'm just putting it out there for your audience. But understanding that the deep state, that same entity that we all sort of rail against and talk about, exists everywhere around the world in every government pulpit, save less than a dozen worldwide. It becomes very clear that anyone with significant military clout, significant intelligence community clout, is likely heavily involved, co-opted, potentially even orchestrating some of the machinations of that very entity, and Israel is no exception. Neither is Hamas, by the way, but we'll come back to that here very shortly. So fundamentally, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is a broader stroke that is driving massive amounts of realignment to come in the Middle Eastern world. The Fertile Crescent, formerly ancient Mesopotamia, Arabia, now Saudi Arabia. These areas of the world have been targeted for infiltration and heavily infiltrated by this occultic cabal for literally thousands of years. We could spend an entire broadcast talking about the history of the Middle East and the history of, even the biblical days and how that ties into the machinations of power throughout those, 1,000 years prior to the time of Christ, and then the beginning of the Roman Empire, the fall of Carthage, et cetera, moving forward. But fundamentally, it's just worth remembering that this is an area of the world that has had their attention and had their interest, involvement, participation, and to some degree significant control for a very, very long time. So now what we have in the present world format, post-World War I, we had the fragmentation, of course, of the Ottoman Empire. We had the military occupation of a land that was formerly Palestine and had been Palestine for several thousand years at that particular point in time. We're talking about the fragmentation later in the 20th century of the lawful Persian government, later renamed Iran, of course, after the turn of the 20th century. The installation of a U.S.-aligned interest in the form of a Shah and a monarchy that was very Western, Western friendly to the intelligence communities, but fundamentally was very tyrannical inside their own people. And it's worth remembering that we did that, by the way, in the 1950s. It was our great State Department and CIA that deposed the lawful government of Tehran that was not bothering anyone at the world at the time, because we wanted their oil and we didn't want them to ask us any questions about it. So we've created that situation, of course, in that area of the world. We've created what we've created with Iraq, for example, the the assault on antiquity. We know from leaked emails from the Hillary server that one of the aims of the Iraq operations was to locate an ancient tomb that was believed to be the tomb of Gilgamesh. It was also believed to host very significant technology that would be of interest to the military intelligence community. So all of this plays into this Israel-Palestine conflict. In 2006, this is where it comes back around to how do you manufacture crisis so that you can move pieces around the game board, and the undoing of that, which we're witnessing now. In 2006, there was an election held. You've seen a lot of individuals online probably point to this election as being, part and parcel for the justification to obliterate Hamas, regardless of what sort of apparatus of shelter and reprehensible, morally disgusting tactics they might actually be utilizing, because of course the Palestinians voted for them. That's the mantra. That's not actually true. The United States State Department coordinated and funded that entire election, including providing the equipment on which the ballots were processed and cast. The United States State Department and CIA were heavily involved in post-war negotiations after the 2005 war between the State of Israel and the Palestinian region. The United States CIA, as well as the Israeli Mossad, going back to the late 1990s, had a vested interest in deposing the Palestinian Authority, and I forget the man's name, I believe it was Yasser Arafat, because he was a proponent for a very middle-of-the-road approach to things, and yet at the same time was not willing to acquiesce to the demands coming from both Tel Aviv and Washington with respect to rights to energy. And with respect to energy, we're talking about the oil reserves beneath the Gaza Strip that Yasser Arafat was acutely aware of and knew about. So between the late 1990s and, of course, 2006, we saw several skirmishes in that area that ultimately resulted in the election of Hamas. Hamas was an installed and paid for U.S. State Department weapon of statecraft that allowed for the Israeli intelligence community to essentially blackmail, bribe, and control all of their top members and attain what they wanted anyway. They did not want political blowback with respect to the Israeli blockade, so they received none. They did not want political blowback with respect to the extortion of financial remuneration from the Gazan people and the Palestinian people in that area, so they received none. They wanted license to start off any conflict that they needed to further specific aims regionally, so that was always made possible through Hamas and Hamas's so-called connections, a great deal of which were also created by the US CIA. So what we have at the present time is very much an undoing of the serpent hydra around the necks of we the people in all of the nations in the Middle East, save for maybe a couple of those nations. And even in those couple that would be accepted to that rule, you still have significant infiltration in what you would be considered their senates or their parliaments or their houses of legislative bodies. So fundamentally, we're moving into a period now where I think we're going to see significant escalation in this conflict because the Tel Aviv intelligence community is very old, very well adept, and very good at controlling a significant amount of functions, not the least of which is Western world election software systems and election software companies that are owned in at least 3 instances that I've managed to research and operated by individuals having citizenship tracing back to Tel Aviv and also dual citizens in the respective countries that those systems are being operated in. So the setup very much a setup or an ancestral fight between this group of individuals that are what I would term imposters to certain bloodlines, and I'll just leave it at that, coming out of Tel Aviv and coming out of the conflated with the ancient Assyrian day Syria, the ancient Persians, which of course is the modern day version of Iran, and we've seen that saber rattling pretty loudly. The Ottomans to the north in the form of the Turks, and the Arabs, the Arabians, in the form of Saudi Arabia to the south. Saudi Arabia is a whole other story of co-opting and infiltration going back a couple of hundred years, all simply where time prohibited on that today. So looking at the sequence of events that we now have, what is in the news? We've seen Israel now attacking to the north after having essentially run the Palestinian people almost all of the way out of the Strip to the south in an on-narrative Erdogan, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, and Israel, and Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, and Israel, and Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, 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 and Turkish government accusations and condemnations of what they believe to be international litigation with respect to war crimes on both the sides of Hamas and the sides of the Tel Aviv government. And I think what we have now is the buildup for that broader conflict to involve Assyria and Persia, and then shortly thereafter to be stabilized and essentially put to a stop by the Arabians and the Turks. What is so amazing about this, Bosi, is in this process, something that was never thought achievable is likely to happen. And that's the unification in at least cooperative behavioral format between the Shia and the Sunnis. These two factions of Islam have been essentially fighting one another for over 1,000 years. It's been a pretty significant disagreement, if you want to call it that, that's been generational in nature, and it very much is, lends itself to the premise and the predicate of a holy war style situation. You yourself, having been there for a while, are probably familiar with just how deeply these people take their convictions and just how deeply their behavior each day models their convictions, even if those convictions may be considered reprehensible by us here in the NATO West. So looking at the expansion of this conflict, we are currently seeing Israel court open war with Hezbollah. Hezbollah is an extension of the Iranian deep state and the Iranian military intelligence community. Hezbollah has also caused problems for Assad in Syria, who is very closely aligned with Moscow. I think it's very likely that we see in the expansion of this conflict, Syria drawn into the fight somehow, whether it's to put a stop to Hezbollah, whether it's to put a stop to Israel, whether it's to put a stop to both of them. And I think that's going to draw very significant and grave mistakes from the Israeli military intelligence community. I believe those mistakes are going to be twofold. One of those mistakes is going to be a massive strike on the Syrian capital of Damascus. Another mistake, I think, is going to be a massive strike on Iranian nuclear infrastructure in the far east of the countryside of Iran, which will immediately cause a radioactive style event, or could cause a radioactive style event, maybe is a better way to say it, and would certainly lead to an expansion of conflict out of Iran and Iraq and probably Egypt as well. With all of this, spanning off and happening, it's impossible that the Turks and the Arabians are going to stay out of it. And the Turks and the Arabians ancestrally over the last 3,000 years have essentially managed the Muslim world. They've been the de facto protectors, the de facto stable institutions and infrastructures over periods of hundreds of years to maintain these territories, to learn the Arabian deserts, for example, to protect the Euphrates and the Tigris. So I think it's extremely likely in this process, as we watch this very rapid escalation being courted by these deep state morons, that you're going to see a fragmentation of NATO in the form of Turkey entering the conflict from the north and heading directly into Israel in a foot soldier on the ground invasion style fashion. And it's very possible at the same time, or concurrently with that, you see Saudi Arabia, and in particular their air force, disappointing the air forces and the military capabilities of Tehran and Persia, sort of like two parents putting a stop to all of the fighting in the room.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. SG, we're just about run out of time. We've got a couple of more minutes. The way I'd like to finish this is just focus on the way that we at A1 look at this. You may have heard me say that our job isn't the tribulations of war. That's for somebody else to do, and they're doing it magnificently. We, the people, our job are the great labors of peace that will follow. And the picture that I've painted is it's a new world, but not the one that they ordered. It's a bit of a play on words created by a friend of mine. There will be a new world, but not the one they ordered. This is going to be the one we're going to build from the ground up. We're going to have to learn what it is to be genuinely a moral, sovereign, self-reliant people. We're going to have to create our constitutional republic. We're going to have to create our nation. And the picture we've painted is realistic. It's going to be an extraordinarily different place. The power will be in the hands of the people: political power, economic power, financial power, cultural power. It'll be in their hands, and then we've got this journey to build it. So if you could finish off now with perhaps a prognostication, but what you see as a potential post-conflict, meaning we've got this period of martial law in order to stabilize the planet, and then the progressive release back to the people of their sovereign powers to rebuild the planet. So just give us your thoughts on that for a couple of minutes, and then we'll call it a day. Thanks, SG.
I'd be happy to, and you sort of stole the words right out of my mouth anyway with respect to closing thoughts. It always comes back to we the people, we the people, we the people. That entity online characterizes we the people as integrally important to a military-civilian alliance. I'm not sure we really understand here anymore in the Western world, because it's been so many generations since our great veterans dealt in those on-the-ground wars. But when you are part and parcel in an alliance serving a military campaign with an aim to preserve society and your way of life, that's a very high degree of authority to enjoy. We, the people, are the regents and the inheritors of this planet. We are important in this process. And in fact, the military describes us in many regards as necessary. None of this is possible, for example, unless we wake up and come into our own, so to speak. And so post-conflict, I think this is the training period. This is our IADT. This is our MOS school to get ready for what is to come. We will be asked to adjudicate justice at some point. We will be asked as civilian interim authorities to determine what level of punishment is appropriate for some of these individuals. We will be asked in many regards and in many respects to testify about what happened in our own communities, what we saw in our own doctor's offices, in our own Department of Motor Vehicle and Licensing offices, in our own healthcare practitioners' offices, and certainly within our militaries. So, that's no small measuring stick to have, if I may. That's a very intense amount of responsibility. It is an amount of responsibility that we, the people, sort of abdicated over a period of a very long time. We didn't necessarily do it on purpose. We got talked out of it. We got worked out of it. Things got busier. Life got faster. Things got more convenient, and we got more, enjoyable of the bread and circus, and that's fine. But understanding now that we are where we are and we have to sort of reorient, recalibrate, and come back to that. And then once we do that, we will have to then dispense with that authority and power. We will have to administer a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. This is a period of time of intense discovery and education, the likes of which has never been seen coordinated in this fashion in all of world history. So fundamentally, if I may, Lieutenant Colonel, it excites me greatly post-conflict, because we are learning all about our identities and our heritages now in ways that many of us, even enjoying good educations, never really truly appreciated. We have perspective on events that unify our cultures in ways that we never knew existed. We certainly understand more of the history of how we arrived here so that we can prevent that going forward. Now it's up to us to step into our confidence, our prowess, our precision, and be willing to do those action steps, be willing to go outside and talk to people and be a part of the community again, so that we can administer these communities in the way we always knew they were supposed to have been done.
Well said. Thank you, sir. All right. We are done. We're at time. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been blessed with SG Anon. He is a man much sought after, and for good reason. He's much appreciated and very well respected. His words carry weight. So I recommend that you watch this again and really focus on what is outlined for us in order to be better informed. As I said, it's better to be informed than ignorant, because once you're informed, things make sense. When things make sense, things are more tolerable, and you can take action. You can actually plan at least some aspects of your life. So SG, thank you, sir. We appreciate it. We'll be in touch again, I hope, and we have another chat as the weeks and months progress. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ricardo Bosi, National Leader of Australia One. Thank you for your time. We'll see you next week.